All right, welcome everybody. We are going to continue working now with exclusively the ggplot2 package to create graphics in R. So there is a link to this Colab notebook in this video, and we'll continue working along. And so Wilkinson derived the grammar of graphics, which is kind of the underlying principle behind the ggplot2 package to describe the inherent properties foundational to all statistical graphics. And this is kind of a layered um, grammar of graphics that was later developed by Wickham that built on Wilkinson's grammar. So Wilkinson was the developer of the grammar of graphics, and then Wickham later came along and built off of that, and that's how ggplot2 was developed. And so a first description of these basic ingredients we're going to walk through below, but it's kind of a layering mechanism. And so we'll kind of think about that. So just keep in mind that we're kind of just going to think about how we can layer different elements and add different layers to our graph. So we're going to start with kind of the basics and then slowly just think about how we can layer some more information on top of basic information, and we can really customize our graphs. But it's important to acknowledge the limitations of this system, and what ggplot2 does not do is it does not tell us really which graphics we should use in order to answer the questions we're interested in. So we still need humans to do statistical analysis and do exploratory data analysis. And we still need humans to understand like which data visualization is the best one at uncovering relations between our variables and at uncovering interesting features about our data and coming up with what are interesting questions to ask about our data. So that is not something that ggplot is going to do for us. Okay, so the basic ingredients you needed to produce a graphic using ggplot2, there are really four main ingredients. So the first thing we need in order to really create any graphic is data. So we need a data frame. And as we've been working with all data frames so far, these data frames should be tidy in the sense that we want each row of our data frame to be a different observation, and each column of our data frame should be a different variable. But that's how we've been organizing our data thus far. We need a ggplot object, and this is going to be initialized using the ggplot function, and we'll illustrate this in a moment below. The third component that we're going to need is an aesthetic mapping. So in other words, we're going to need to indicate like what variable are we going to plot on the x-axis? What variable, if any of them, are we going to plot on the y-axis? What variable is going to control the color? What variable is going to control the size of the points and so on? So we can map different variables to different features of our plot if we want to. And the last component that we're going to need to define is going to be a geometric object. These are called geomes for short. And this is really in telling ggplot what type of plot do we want to use. So do we want to use a scatter plot, histogram, density, box plot, etc. So in three, we're kind of in element three, the mapping is saying which variables playing which role in our plot, and the geometric object, the geome, is telling ggplot which type of plot ultimately are you going to generate. And so this is spelled out in really nice detail in R for data science. So there is a link to that text over there. But how that text suggests we kind of define our ggplot object is we input the data and the mapping in our ggplot object. So that would all of these first three things are defined in the ggplot object, and then we add on our geom afterwards. So let me kind of illustrate what that means with an example. So let's use that MPG data frame that we talked about earlier. And so if you're just running this notebook for the very first time and you haven't run any of the previous code cells, you're going to encounter an error because you need to load the ggplot2 package. So you might just want to go to the runtime, run before to make sure you run all of the previous code cells so that you're up to speed, so to speak. That's a nice pun since the MPG data frame has a bunch of car data. Okay. So the first step is to just create a data frame, to input a data frame into our ggplot object. So this just creates an empty graph. We haven't mapped any aesthetics yet, so we haven't said map this variable on the x-axis and map that variable on the y-axis. So that's why we have a blank graph. But once again, these ggplot2, we have a nice grammar of graphics involved here. So we're going to build our plots with layers. So this is kind of the first layer of our canvas. This is just like laying out the blank canvas. And now we're going to paint on top of this blank canvas. We're going to paint our plot on top of this blank canvas. So step one, whenever you're creating a painting, right, is we need a canvas. So here's our canvas. We input the data into our object. Next, we would need, after we input our data, is we define our aesthetic mapping. So in this case, if we're creating, say, a scatter plot to look at the relationship between the engine displacement and the city miles per gallon, I would need to define which variable is going on the x-axis, which variable is going on the y-axis. So I'm going to run this code cell. And now we've defined which variable is going on the x-axis. That's the displacement variable. And we've got which variable is going on the y-axis, which is the city miles per gallon. But we haven't defined a geometric object. We haven't defined the geom yet. So we haven't told which type of graph we want to create. So next we want to add a layer to our graphic, and then we want to add a geom to our plot. In this case, we want to add a scatter plot. So after I've input my data and the mapping, I add a plus here, and then I would say I want to create a scatter plot, and that geom is geom point. And there we go. So I just want to emphasize here that we're actually going to get much more into the details of creating scatter plots, not even in this notebook, but in the next notebook, which is going to be like going beyond the starting point. So the scatter plots will be like a slightly more advanced point. What I'm trying to illustrate right now is just like how the general process behind creating a ggplot works. And it's just this layering. So we started, the first layer was creating just like the blank canvas by inputting our data. Then kind of the next layer was saying what's being mapped on the X and the Y axis. And then finally we say, hey, what is the geometric mapping that we're going to use here? How are you representing the data? We're going to represent them as a scatter plot, and that is the geom point. And we can truncate this code. We typically don't need to say data equals mapping equals. Those are implied that the very first thing is the data and the next thing is the mapping. So we typically don't actually need to enter data equals MPG, mapping equals aesthetic. We typically leave those off, and this creates exactly the same plot. So when we're going to work on our code and develop this in more detail in this notebook in a moment, we're actually not going to say data equals and mapping equals. We'll be a little bit more concise. And we can customize things in all sorts of ways. So I can change the text size. That's all I've done here. These might be hard to read if you're thinking this is really small. I can change the text size. I can make these points larger, so things are very easily customizable. Um, we can kind of change how we enter things into a ggplot. So it's possible that instead of entering the mapping aesthetic into the ggplot, you could enter that into the geom. I'm just mentioning this here that the syntax is flexible in these, so it's not so rigid. Um, as we create these plots, I'm not going to create every plot in 10 different ways. So I'm going to stick to the convention that we're going to enter the data and the mapping aesthetic in the ggplot object in the very first step. So that's the convention I'm going to use. But I just want to let you know that there is some flexibility in the syntax and how you do things. Yeah, and so here's kind of that code that we entered. And what's nice is that this stuff is very flexible. So if instead I wanted to say like, hey, what's the relation not between engine displacement and city miles per gallon, but maybe I wanted to compare like city miles per gallon and highway mile per gallon. Well, then all I need to do is just change, displacement to highway, and the rest of the code just stays exactly the same. And it makes sense here that we have a pretty strong correlation that as fuel efficiency for highway goes up, as a car gets more fuel efficient for highway, it gets more fuel efficient for city as well. And if we want to change to some other type of graph, like a histogram, then we just change the geom from a point to a histogram. And if we want to create a bar chart, then we just change the geom to bar and we create a bar chart. So we'll talk about these details next, how we create these different type of charts. But what I'm trying to get at is that there's a nice logic here. We just kind of input the data. We define which variable is being mapped to which object in the plot, x-axis, y-axis, maybe a color. And then we just define what type of plot we're going to create and out come really nice graphics. And then we can kind of clean up the font size and other things without too much trouble. Okay, and so I just want to leave this video lastly. Down here is just a nice dictionary of all of the different geoms that are possible. In this video, we're going to go through bar charts, density charts, histograms, box plots, and violin plots. So we're going to go through the first couple of ones, and not all of them. So we're going to go through the first couple of geoms in this video. And there are also a dictionary of some common aesthetic mappings. So we've talked about mapping to the x-axis, the y-axis. We'll also see what the alpha aesthetic does, the color and the fill. I think we'll actually see a bunch of these other aesthetics at some point in this notebook as well. Okay, so we'll take a break here and come back in the next video working with Penguins data and creating a bar chart using the Penguins data. Thanks, everyone.